Genesis lists the curses that came to humanity as a result of sin. For men, this was back-breaking labour caused by weeds and poor soil. Women suffered the labour of painful childbirth, and they also suffered submission to a husband. We've been able to minimise the consequences of most of these using weed killer, tractors and analgesics in labour, something we surely all thank God for. But what about wifely submission? Is that something we should still encourage? Romans regarded the ideal woman as submissive, demure, thrifty. But these ideals started to crumble just before New Testament times, when an emancipation movement started. Wives had recently gained the legal right to spend their own money without their husband's permission. And by New Testament times, women were also enacting equality by taking lovers, just like their husbands did. Josephus, a Jewish historian at the time, commended Judaism to his Roman readership by saying that the Bible says the woman is in all things inferior to the man. This is a lie, of course, there's no verse anything like that, but he knew his readers would love it. He then summarised the law of Moses in a way that mirrored Aristotle's three maxims. 1. Wives should submit to husbands. 2. Children should submit to fathers. And 3. Slaves should submit to masters. And you might recognise that teaching of Aristotle, because Paul and Peter also commend his threefold submission. But they had different reasons and less enthusiasm. They agreed that slaves should submit, but they warned that masters should not mistreat them. Likewise, they agreed that children should submit, but warned that fathers should not debase them. And they agreed that wives should submit, but added that husbands should love them sacrificially. It was important for Paul and Peter to commend Aristotle's rules, albeit with these warnings, because they endangered the Christian message if they taught equality instead. They knew that encouraging a lack of submission in family life would be interpreted as encouraging that female immorality of the Roman world. Christian wives would be regarded like the licentious Roman equal rights women, so unbelievers would then malign their religion. They therefore told Christians to submit even to cruel masters and to unbelieving husbands in order to advance the gospel. I find it impressive and humbling that believers in New Testament times were willing to put up with cruel masters and micromanaging husbands so that people wouldn't get a bad impression about their new religion. If they hadn't done this, Christianity would have had a much harder time spreading. So, should Christian wives submit to their husbands in today's culture? Well, that depends partly on what they promised in their marriage vows. Traditional Anglican marriage vows reflect the language of Ephesians 5:21-29, where Christ loves, cherishes, and nourishes his church. These three became our marriage vows, and the language morphed into love, honour, and keep. At some point, the word obey was added. Presumably, this also derives from Ephesians 5, where it says wives submit. However, in Ephesians, these words follow immediately after an injunction for both men and women to submit to one another. The traditional marriage services didn't only demand submission from wives. Grooms also promised to submit, because they said, "With my body I thee worship." The Old English "to worship" means to serve obediently. We still use it in courts when we call the judge "your worship." This isn't because he's godlike, but because we acknowledge our submission to his court. Surprisingly, the one-sided obedience by a wife is a very recent innovation in Church of England weddings. Until a few years ago, if a woman promised to obey, the man also had to promise to worship. That is, to submit to. The first time that brides were allowed to promise to obey without their husband reciprocating it was in the year 2000. This is when Common Worship was published, and that didn't include this rule. So, submission by the wife alone was not available in Church of England wedding vows before this millennium. Couples had to either obey, or they had to both promise to submit to each other, as in Ephesians 5:21. After all, two people committed to serving each other are much more likely to live harmoniously than one or both of them trying to be the boss. God bless.